Somewhere right now, a home brewer is standing in a garage, staring at a 5-gallon bucket of something that finally tastes right. And they're thinking what thousands of people before them have thought. If I can make beer this good in here, imagine what I could do with a real building, a real brew house, a taproom full of people who actually get it. Quit the job, brew what you love, watch it grow into the kind of name people recognize on a grocery shelf. Nobody tells that homebrewer the twist. The beer is almost never what kills a brewery. What kills it is a liquor law from the 1970s that most owners never read until it's already too late. And the moment your beer succeeds enough to need a distributor is the exact moment you sign away control of it. Forever. Let's talk about what it actually costs to walk through that door in the first place. A tiny nano brewery, a few barrels and a folding table, can technically open for around $50,000. That's the number people repeat at parties, and it's also almost meaningless, because nobody builds a real business at nanoscale. The second you want an actual taproom, a working brew house, a bar, maybe a kitchen, the number jumps to somewhere between $350,000 and $1.5 million. Want to compete at real production scale, with genuine distribution ambitions? Budget $500,000 in equipment and build-out alone, before a single permit is filed. Speaking of permits, set aside $25,000 to $75,000 just for licensing. Federal approval, state alcohol permits, health department sign-off, business licenses stacked on top of each other. None of it brews a drop of beer. All of it has to be paid before you're legally allowed to try. Then the building itself. Anywhere from $75,000 to $400,000 or more, depending on whether you're leasing a shell in a small town or squeezing a brew house into an expensive city block. You'll also want $100,000 to $250,000 sitting untouched as a cushion, because here's the number that should actually give you pause. It typically takes 18 to 36 months for a new brewery to turn a profit. 2 to 3 years of bleeding cash before the business can support itself. Stack it all up a certain way, and a real microbrewery with a taproom needs something close to $1.2 million just to open the doors and survive long enough to matter, which is exactly why the used equipment market has quietly become its own little economy. Hundreds of breweries close every single year, and when they do, their tanks don't vanish. They get auctioned. A 7-barrel brew house that runs $100,000 to $180,000 new can be picked up used for $40,000 to $80,000. Fermenters hold their value even better, since stainless steel basically doesn't wear out. So the brewery closing down the street isn't just a sad headline scrolling past. It's inventory. Someone, somewhere is furnishing their dream on the bones of somebody else's. That's the entry price. Pay it. Survive a couple of thin years, and you've earned the right to play the actual game. And the actual game isn't decided in the brew house. It's decided by exactly how that beer leaves the building. Here's where it gets interesting, because the same identical pint of beer is worth wildly different amounts of money, depending on which door it walks out of. Almost nobody explains this part clearly, and it's the part that ends up deciding whether a brewery thrives or just limps along. Start at the top. A pint sold across your own bar goes for around $8, and it costs you almost nothing to pour. Gross margins sits around 75%. 75 cents of every dollar, yours to keep. That is, by a wide margin, the best money in the entire business. It's not a marketing gimmick to get people through the door. For most successful small breweries today, the taproom simply is the business model. Now take that exact same beer and put it in a keg headed for a bar down the street. Same recipe, same tank, same yeast. Except now you're selling wholesale, the bar marks it up for their own pour, and your share of the revenue drops to roughly 30% of what you'd have made pouring it yourself. Same liquid, less than a third of the money. Widen the lens further, and the gap turns almost absurd. A barrel sold through the taproom generates somewhere between 5 and 8 times more revenue than the identical barrel sold through a distributor. Read that back 5 to 8 times. Not because the beer is different, because of how many hands take a cut before the money finds its way back to you. So why would any brewery ever leave the taproom at all? Because a taproom can only hold so many people, and a neighborhood can only drink so many pints. Grow past your own four walls, and eventually you have to package the beer, which means a canning line. Even a modest one, capable of maybe 15 to 35 cans a minute, runs about $50,000. That single purchase changes what your brewery is capable of. It's the difference between a place people visit and a product people keep in their fridge. But packaging isn't free money, it's the price of admission to a lower margin game. Once your beer sits on a shelf instead of pouring across your own bar, a distributor's markup and a retailer's markup both get taken out before you see a cent. Volume goes up. Margin per unit goes down. And if your canning line can't keep pace with what your brew house can actually produce, you've built a bottleneck into your own factory. All that brewing capacity, just sitting there, waiting on a machine that fills one can at a time. Above packaging sits full wholesale distribution, the tier that gets a brewery onto menus and shelves across an entire region instead of one neighborhood. It's also, per ounce, the thinnest margin in the whole business. You're now 3 parties removed from the person actually drinking your beer. You, the distributor, the retailer, each one needing a cut before the transaction closes. Distribution was never where breweries make their money. It's where breweries buy reach, and they pay for that reach in margin. And then there's the layer almost nobody accounts for at the start. The stuff around the beer, merchandise, private events, tours, a wedding booked in the taproom on a slow Tuesday. None of it moves much volume. Almost all of it runs close to full margin, because at that point you're not really selling a product, you're selling access to a space people already like being in. Stack all 5 of these together, and the actual shape of a brewery's finances comes into focus, and it looks nothing like the naive picture from the garage. It isn't one revenue stream called selling beer. It's 5 separate businesses layered on top of each other, each with its own margin, its own ceiling, its own reason to exist. And the tension running through all of them is the same. Growth and margin pull in opposite directions. Every step toward more customers costs you a piece of what you keep from each one. A brewery that stays small and taproom only can run at genuinely excellent margins, and plenty of them do exactly that on purpose, capping their own growth rather than chasing volume. A brewery that wants to become a real regional name has to walk down through these layers, trading margin for reach at every single step, betting that enough new volume will make up for a shrinking cut of each sale. That bet is where things get dangerous. Because the layer where a brewery finally earns real distribution isn't just a lower margin version of the same business. It comes with a legal structure attached that most owners don't fully understand until they're already standing inside it. To understand the trap, you need to know about a law almost no beer drinker has ever heard of, even though it shapes nearly everything they drink. After Prohibition ended, states were terrified of sliding back into the old system, the one where a handful of giant brewers owned the bars, owned the distribution, and could crush anyone smaller at will. So most states built something called the 3-tier system. The brewer makes the beer. A separate independently owned distributor moves it. A separate retailer, the bar or the store, sells it to you. In the strictest states, these tiers can't overlap at all. A brewery can't just sell directly to a store or directly to you the way a t-shirt company could sell off its own website. Legally, across most of the country, there has to be a middleman standing in between. On its own, that's just an old quirk of liquor law, not a trap. The trap gets built one layer beneath it. Starting in the 70s and 80s, back when a handful of national beer giants dwarfed every small local distributor, states passed something called beer franchise laws designed to protect those small distributors from getting dropped the second a big brewer felt like switching partners. And here's the part that matters decades later. Those laws never went away. They still apply. So the moment a small brewery signs a distribution agreement, even a handshake deal, even a single email, in most states that agreement counts as exclusive and, for all practical purposes, permanent. The distributor gets the sole right to sell that brewery's beer in an assigned territory, and that right simply doesn't expire. Walk through what that actually means. A brewery grows. The taproom fills up most weekends, and the obvious next step is packaging, cans, a distributor, real shelf space in real grocery stores. So they sign. For a while, everybody wins. But distributors are running their own business too, juggling dozens of other brands at once, and craft beer brands fall in and out of fashion fast. Say the distributor's enthusiasm cools. Say a bigger, more profitable brand comes along, and yours quietly slides to the back of the warehouse. Say they just stop performing. Under most state franchise laws, that brewery has almost no way to get its own distribution rights back. Courts have upheld these contracts again and again, even when the distributor does next to nothing with the brand. The distributor could stop actively selling the beer entirely and, in most states, still owe nothing back. That's the domino, and here's how it falls. A brewery grows past the taproom to chase real volume. Growing past the taproom means trading margin for reach, the same trade we already watched happen with kegs and cans. So distribution volume climbs while the average margin per barrel quietly shrinks underneath it. Meanwhile, the fixed costs don't shrink at all. The lease is the same. The loan payments are the same. The staff is still on payroll. If the distributor holding those exclusive rights underperforms, there's no do-over. The brewery can't switch partners, can't take the business back in-house. It's stuck selling through the exact channel, dragging its margins down, with a legal wall standing in front of the one obvious fix. The brewery ends up trapped in the sliced profitable version of its own business. And the trap wasn't a bad decision or bad beer. It was a structural feature of the system, sitting quietly in the fine print of the deal they signed the day they decided to grow. Which is why the taproom is the business model, isn't a slogan. It's a survival strategy. Every barrel that leaves through the front door as a pint stays fully under the brewery's own control and keeps its full margin. Every barrel that leaves in a distributor's truck is a barrel the brewery has, in a meaningful sense, handed away. Not just the profit, the ability to ever take it back. Theory is one thing. Watching it happen to a real brewery is another. Take Rogue Ales and Spirits, out of Oregon. For most of its history, Rogue wasn't some struggling nobody. It was a first-wave pioneer, one of the breweries that helped invent what craft beer even meant in this country. 37 years in business. Well into the 2020s, it was still a top 50 volume player on the Brewers Association's own rankings. This wasn't a brewery that never figured out how to make good beer. In its heyday, it was trying things no one else in the country was even considering. And then in late November, it was gone. Not a slow wind down, an abrupt one. Rogue idled its distillery operations, shut all 6 of its taprooms within days, and by November 24th had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The numbers in that filing are worth sitting with. Nearly $17 million in debts against roughly $5 million in assets. A brewery that spent decades building a national name collapsed owing more than $3 for every dollar it had left. How does a top 50 brewery end up there? Part of it is the industry-wide bleed we've already touched on. Production down, competition up, a market that's been cooling for years. But part of it is exactly the structural squeeze we just walked through. A brewery that kept expanding outward, into distilling, into distribution, into more territory and more channels, each one trading away margin for reach, until the fixed cost of running that much footprint outran what any of those thinner margin channels could actually support. By the time taproom pours weren't enough to carry everything built on top of them, there was no lever left to pull. Now go back further, to a brewery even Rogue would have looked up to. Anchor Brewing out of San Francisco. Founded in 1869, Not a craft beer era startup, the actual origin point, the brewery most historians point to as the true birth of American craft beer, over a century before the term even existed. In August 2017, Japan's Sapporo Holdings clearly agreed the name meant something, buying Anchor for $85 million. 4 years later, in January 2021, new ownership tried to modernize the brand. A rebrand, a fresh look, an attempt to shed the old red banner and blue anchor for something newer. It didn't land. Sales kept slipping. And in July 2023, Anchor Brewing, 154 years old, the brewery that arguably started the entire industry this video is about, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and shut its doors completely. $85 million, 6 years earlier. Gone. It took until May 2024 for Chobani founder Hamdi Ulukaya to step in and buy the company's remaining assets. And even then, the brewery didn't simply reopen. The 154-year run had already ended. Neither of these is a story about bad beer. Rogue and Anchor both made products people genuinely respected for decades. What both stories actually show is that size and history offer almost no protection against the mechanics we've just laid out. The margin that erodes every time beer travels farther from the tap. The growth that, once locked into a distribution structure, can't easily be undone if the bet stops paying off. And these two aren't outliers, they're just the versions of this story with a household name attached. In 2025 alone, 434 American craft breweries closed, while only 268 opened, continuing a slide that started back in 2023, when 385 breweries shut down in a single year for the first time. So picture the two owners standing at that same fork, years apart, watching the decision play out in opposite directions. The best case looks almost boring from the outside. A brewery that stays small on purpose. Taproom only, or close to it. Growth capped, not by a lack of ambition, but by design. Every pint poured across its own bar at that beautiful 75% margin, never handed off to a distributor, never subject to a franchise law it can't escape. It probably never becomes a national name. It never shows up on anyone's top 50 list. But it also never wakes up one November morning $12 million underwater, because it never signed away the one lever that would have let it fix things. The worst case looks like success for years before it looks like anything else. Growth, distribution deals, cans on shelves in 3 states, every signal pointing up and to the right up until the margin has quietly thinned out from underneath the volume. The fixed costs don't care how thin that margin got. And the contract signed years earlier to make all that growth possible turns out to have no exit clause. By the time the owner sees the trap, the paperwork was signed long ago. Here's what actually makes brewery ownership different from almost any other small business fantasy. The danger was never the beer, never the recipe, the yeast, the taste. The entire trajectory, whether it becomes the cozy neighborhood spot quietly doing great business for 20 years, or the celebrated regional name that collapses in a single November week, gets decided the day someone signs a piece of paper they were told was just the cost of growing up. Which means the real product a brewery sells was never the beer at all. It's the last few feet between the tank and the glass. And the day an owner hands that distance to somebody else is the day they stop owning the business they thought they'd built. Even if their name is still on the sign out front.